Look around you. Your clothes? Probably made in Vietnam, Egypt, or China. The device you're watching this on? Microchips from Taiwan, raw materials from India, designed in Britain, assembled in an American factory. Even the simple things, like that water bottle next to you. It was all made with industrial processes. Now imagine all of it gone. Every coat, hat, shoe, sock, bench, blanket, table, none of it exists. You read the title. What if the Industrial Revolution never happened? First, let's set the stage. Of course, we can't just get rid of it and pretend like nothing happened. We need some context. Could industrialization have been prevented? At first glance, it seems impossible. Progress feels inevitable. But history shows us that innovation can be stifled. For one, powerful monarchies deeply rooted in feudal systems could have crushed the conditions necessary for industry to take hold. In societies where rulers feared change, where the elite benefited from keeping things as they were, innovation could be systematically shut down. Imagine a world where England remained locked in absolute monarchy, never allowing the social and political shifts that fueled industrialization. This isn't just speculation either. We've seen it happen before. Qing China suppressed technological advancements to maintain Confucian order. Tokugawa Japan deliberately isolated itself for over 200 years, halting foreign influence and technological exchange. The Ottoman and Russian empires lagged behind the West in industrialization, partly due to their rigid social structures and resistance to modernization. If these forces had been even stronger, industry could have been smothered before it even began. Climate could have played a role too. If agricultural yields remained high, economies would have continued relying on farming rather than seeking new ways to produce goods efficiently. Because why would you build factories if you already have everything you need in the fields? And then there's religion. In deeply traditional societies, religious leaders could have seen industrialization as a threat to divine order. This isn't without precedent. Historically, religious institutions have resisted scientific progress. When Galileo argued for the heliocentric model of the universe, with the sun at the center, the one that we know and love today, the Catholic Church condemned it as heretical because it contradicted their biblical interpretation. If religious opposition to new ideas had been even stronger and more widespread, industrialization might have never gained traction. There's our context, how this would actually happen. But enough about the how, let's talk about the what. What does this world actually look like? Well, for starters, you wouldn't be scrolling on a screen right now. You'd be in a field, gripping a sickle, harvesting wheat for a family dinner of bread, butter, and fresh milk from the market. No fast food, no electricity, just hard labor and simple survival. Your neighbors would be living the same way. And so would their neighbors, and their neighbors' neighbors, and their neighbors' neighbors' neighbors, and so on. That's if you even had neighbors in the first place. Without mass urbanization, settlements would be spread far and wide. Think American suburbia, but even more boring. Even the so-called cities would be tiny, with merchant hubs like London or Paris holding some influence, but nothing close to the sprawling urban centers they are today. Cities like New York, Tokyo, and Shanghai would be no different, their growth stunted by the trickle of international trade. The world's largest city would likely be somewhere in Beijing, Constantinople, or Mumbai. They're close to the coast and would be large centers of trade, at least in terms of the minuscule trade that we're talking about here. With cities remaining small and trade at a standstill, the spread of ideas and technologies would be greatly hindered. There's little need for mass education if you're relying entirely on agriculture. After all, do you really need to know how to read to work in the fields? Education, instead of being a tool for social mobility, would stagnate just like everything else in this world. Without industry and the advanced jobs that require higher education, there's no push for literacy, technical skills, or science, leaving society trapped in a never-ending cycle like it's Groundhog Day. Only the wealthy, or more accurately, the aristocrats, would be educated. And even then, their education would likely be limited to basic skills, perhaps just to the elementary level and no more. This lack of education, combined with stagnation in every aspect of life, would make social mobility practically non-existent. Born a serf, stay a serf. Born wealthy, stay wealthy. The vast majority of people would remain tied to the land for their entire lives, with no real path to climb the social ladder, except, perhaps, through marriage. But even that would be a long shot. No wealthy king would marry their son or daughter to some good-for-nothing serf, no matter how desperate they were to keep their bloodline going. But that's just the social aspect of it. It's not just individuals who would be trapped in place, entire nations would be too. Without industrialization, innovation and military advancements would stagnate, and the global balance of power would look very different. The United States would remain an agrarian republic, much like Andrew Jackson envisioned. Small farmers, not the industrialists, would shape the economy, and the rapid urban growth of the American Gilded Age would never happen. Slavery, too, would likely persist far longer, not just in the United States, but across the world. Without industrialization reducing the need for mass labor through mechanization, the transatlantic slave trade would remain a dominant force in the global economy. Brazil, or whoever controlled Brazil, would likely be the main proponent of this extended slave trade, as its vast plantations continued to demand a steady supply of forced labor. And while the West would remain stagnant, the same cannot be said for Asia. Empires like the Ottomans, Qing, Mughal, and Persian would be far more powerful. In our timeline, Europe's industrialization allowed it to surpass these empires, imposing colonial rule with advanced weaponry and tactics that were decades ahead of their enemies. But without the Industrial Revolution, that power shift would never happen. Instead of being carved up and dominated, the Ottomans, Qing, and Mughals would likely remain dominant forces. Their massive populations and established trade networks, like the Silk Road, would keep them at the center of global affairs, while Europe, lacking the industrial advantage it had in our timeline, would have no way to challenge them. Without industrialization shaking up the old order, monarchies would continue to dominate across most of the world. Revolutions, such as the French Revolution, likely wouldn't happen. Nationalist movements, like the unifications of Italy and Germany, would be far rarer, as there is no industrial working class to drive them forward. Austria-Hungary and the Russian Empire would likely remain stable and survive far longer than they did in our timeline. But Europe's stagnation wouldn't affect just politics. It would reshape the global balance of power. The British Empire, the largest empire the world has ever seen in our timeline, would never reach that scale. At most, Britain might secure treaty ports in India, along with South Africa, Canada, and Australia. Without industrialization and modernized warfare, colonial expansion would be slow, and European dominance far less overwhelming. By the time the colonization of Africa began in the 19th century, European forces would still be fighting with muskets. Without the technological edge that industrialization provided, such as machine guns, steamships, and railroads, colonial uprisings would be far more effective, keeping European powers on a more equal footing with the native populations. Many African states already had sophisticated military structures, but without the modern weaponry and rapid reinforcements, European forces would struggle to expand beyond coastal trading ports. As a result, much of the African interior would remain independent, and the continent as a whole would be far less colonized than in our timeline. Another major factor is disease. Malaria was already a massive issue for European colonizers, and without industrial advances in medicine, such as the mass production of quinine and later medical breakthroughs, European settlers and soldiers would face even greater mortality rates. Other tropical diseases like yellow fever and sleeping sickness would also limit European expansion, further reducing their global footprint. Along with that, this world would be far more divided by region and geography than our own. The only reliable long-distance travel method would be by boat, since overland travel would be slow and difficult. Some regions, such as the Middle East and North Africa, might still maintain trade routes like the Silk Road and Trans-Saharan networks. But without industrial infrastructure, most people would stick closer to the coastline or river systems where transportation is easier. Communication would also be painfully slow, with messages taking days or even weeks to reach their destinations. One of the biggest consequences of a world without industrialization would be its population. Before the Industrial Revolution, in the 1700s and early 1800s, the world population ranged from about 640 million to just under 1 billion. Without industrialized agriculture, improved sanitation, or modern medicine, population growth would remain slow, struggling to expand beyond the early 19th century levels. The lack of surplus goods would also discourage large families, as people would have fewer resources to support additional children. Overall, without industrialization, Europe's dominance over the world would be significantly reduced, global interactions would be far more limited, and humanity as a whole would remain fragmented, regional, and sparsely populated compared to our timeline. But, of course, it's impossible to truly predict what would happen in a world without the Industrial Revolution. So, I want to hear your thoughts. What do you think would have happened if the Industrial Revolution never took place? Drop your theories in the comments below. I'd love to read them and interact with you guys. And, since you made it to the end of the video, if you want me to keep doing stuff like this in the future, hit that like and subscribe button.